G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Isaiah. This has been taken from a commentary produced by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, the founder of Ariel Ministries. Thank you for coming along. So this is session 18 of Isaiah. We're going to kick off in chapter 36, verse 1. Hopefully we'll get to chapter 37, verse 35. Now, last session, we saw the restoration of Israel. It was brought out in sharp contrast to, remember, Edom, burning wasteland for 1,000 years. Well, and so we see here Israel is going to be restored and beautified. Remember the Negev deserts and the Jordan Rift Valley, nothing but desolation today, but man, they're going to be fantastic to look at. They're going to be, today they're only dry and unproductive, but in the future, they're going to be full of water everywhere. Magnificent production. In the Messianic kingdom, places like Carmel and Sharon and Bashan will also become extremely productive. They're not so today. Shekinah glory will be visible in the land. Well, it's going to be visible because Messiah himself will be in the land. Well, I'll just spoil it there. Why is all this happening? Because God is coming in the person of the Messianic King to live and dwell in Jerusalem. Okay, so results of his coming are twofold. First of all, the people are going to be healed of all infirmities. Remember, we've said that when the king is present, healing takes place. The second result concerns the land, which is going to have an abundance of water. Negev desert is nothing but desert today and stop producing, but we're going to see it in the kingdom going to produce. Same as the Araba problem there. Also, is a lack of water. Again, in the kingdom, water's going to break out. Streams going to break out of the ground. It's just going to be a glorious time. In the kingdom, there'll be a highway. We spoke about a highway. It'll be called the Highway of Holiness. And this highway will pass right through the desert. And the desert's going to be in bloom. Just flowers and things everywhere. However, you need to be eligible to walk or travel on this highway. It will not be for the unclean. It's only going to be for the redeemed. And the returnees who are coming in are the believing remnant of Israel. And they're going to enter Zion with singing and just joy, eternal joy. In fact, they'll be characterized by eternal delight, we said, because they've obtained all this gladness and this exceeding joy because they're now in the land with the Messiah. All things are just wonderful. What they'll not experience is sorrow and sighing, both of which are going to flee away. Okay, coming into tonight's session, let's go. This is the historical interlude now concerning the crisis of the 14th year of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the last king, okay? We're going to look from chapter 36, down to chapter 39, verse 8. And this is the 9th major section of the book of Isaiah. There are 10 major sections. This is number 9. And this one comprises chapter 36 to 39. It's the historical interlude. Again, the crisis of Hezekiah's 14th year. Chapters 28 to 35, which we've completed, dealt with the prophecies which this crisis called forth. Chapter 36 to 39, actual crisis is revealed. Then chapter 38 describes Hezekiah's sickness and recovery. Finally, chapter 39 is going to deal with Hezekiah and the Babylonians. Now, up to this point, book of Isaiah was written in Hebrew poetry. Now, in chapter 36 to 39, it is written in Hebrew prose. It's going to pick up with Hebrew poetry again in chapter 40. Entire book is a poetic book anyway. Now, of the 66 chapters, 62 are written in Hebrew poetry, only 4 are written in prose, and these are the 4 we're going to be looking at. Now, 2 parallel passages for the events described in this section are, first of all, is 2 Kings 18, verse 13 to 2 Kings 20, verse 1 on your screen there. And then we have 2 Chronicles, which just tells what happens in 2 Kings. 2 Chronicles 32, verse 1 to 31. Okay. These 4 chapters are very important for 2 reasons. First, we're going to see a fulfillment of many prophecies from the first 35 chapters of this book. What was prophesied in the first 35 chapters will now become history. And the second thing that makes these 4 chapters important is that there's a transitional period from the Assyrian domination to the next great empire, the Babylonian Empire and Babylonian domination. because the second part of Isaiah, chapters 40 to 66, will no longer be concerned about the Assyrian domination, but with the Babylonian domination. And these chapters, these 36 to 39, form this transition from Assyrian to Babylonian periods. Okay, 3 segments in this book. We're going to look at Hezekiah and the Assyrians in 36:1 to 37:38, which we're going to cover most of that today. And then later on, Hezekiah and the sickness, and then Hezekiah and the Babylonians. Okay, here we go. Now, first section, Hezekiah and the Assyrians. We see the invasion of Sennacherib. Now, it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Now, if you remember, Judah had been under the Assyrian yoke since Isaiah chapter 7, because remember, a king called Ahaz was disobedient to the prophecy of Isaiah, right? And that's why we're in this pickle. Now, this subservience to the Assyrians, which began under King Ahaz, has continued throughout the life of Ahaz until the 14th year of the reign of his son Hezekiah, right? Hezekiah became king in 715 BC. That's before Christ, or before the Common Era. What are you going to do? Now, in the beginning, Hezekiah continued in that subservience, and the entire land, including the Philistine country, was also in subservience. Now, I want to tell you a little bit of background here. Okay, just a bit of background to what happened. In 713 BC, Ashdod was one of those 5 Philistine cities. It rebelled against this Assyrian domination. Now, when Ashdod rebelled, Sargon II, who was the man in charge of Assyria, who destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, came down and replaced the king of Ashdod. In 712, Ashdod rebelled again, 2 times in 2 years, this time under Egyptian agitation. Leader of the revolt at Ashdod was the king called Yamani. Once again, Sargon II returned. Now, Moab and Edom, which joined this revolt, immediately surrendered, right? When they saw the big army, they said, well, we're out of here. Sargon II took Ashdod, that's a Philistine city, and King Yamani now flees to Greece, actually to an island in the Aegean Sea. That's the background to Isaiah chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. And then, from 712 BC onward, the land was now securely under the control of Assyria. In Hezekiah's government, remember in Hezekiah's government, as we pointed out earlier, there was both a pro-Egyptian and a pro-Assyrian element, right? There's a bit of a toss between them. Pro-Egyptian element on the Egyptian agitation was pushing for an alliance with Egypt against the Assyrians, all right? They were pushing for rebellion against the Assyrians. Prophet Isaiah opposed this. He says, no, don't do that. Stay underneath the Assyrians. This is what brought about the prophecies of Isaiah chapter 28 to 35, which we looked at. Now, in the year 705 BC, Sargon II died. Now, with the death of Sargon II, Sennacherib, his son, takes over. And when Sargon's son Sennacherib came to the throne, revolts were sprouting up everywhere. They thought, new king, let's have a go. Now, among the first to rebel was King Hezekiah. Not only did he join the revolt against Assyria in direct disobedience to the prophet Isaiah, but eventually he actually became its leader. 2 Kings 18 verse 7 tells us that. 2 Kings 18:7. With Hezekiah taking the lead of the revolt against the Assyrians with Egyptian backing, he called for alliances. Now, both Edom and Moab joined him. Philistine city of Gaza refused to join him, so he conquered the city of Gaza and settled it with Judeans. We see that in 2 Kings 18 verse 8. 2 Kings 18:8. Now, king of Ekron. Now, Ekron's another Philistine city whose king was a man called Paddy, P-A-D-I. He wasn't Irish, his name was Paddy. He also refused to join the revolt, even though the citizens of Ekron wanted to revolt. So he didn't want to join. So the citizens just simply deposed him and turned over. He was deposed by citizens and then turned over to Hezekiah. Hezekiah imprisoned him in the city, and Much of the information now comes from the Assyrian records, right? And there are parallel accounts between the biblical record and the Assyrian records of what happened in the 14th year. Still some more history. Revolt formally taken by Hezekiah, he began to prepare for a lengthy siege. And one of the things he did was he built an underground tunnel about 500 meters long that connected Jerusalem's main water source, the Gihon Spring, with the Pool of Siloam. There's a picture there of the tunnel, right? The tunnel was designed to keep the entire outflow of the spring inside the walled area of Jerusalem, which included the downstream Pool of Siloam. Now, the purpose of this tunnel was to withhold water from any besieging forces, so the troops positioned outside the walls, like the Assyrians, wouldn't be able to reach any of these water sources. So this blocked off all access of Jerusalem's water supply to the Assyrians. This underground tunnel is mentioned in 2 Kings 20 verse 20, 2 Kings 20 verse 20, 2 Chronicles 32 verse 30. Now, archaeologists have discovered this tunnel. In fact, you can actually walk through this tunnel. I speaking to friends in the US, and they walk through this tunnel, and the water sometimes gets up to their knees. Now, Hezekiah also fortified the city walls. Okay, a little bit more history. In 701 BC, the Assyrians invaded. The king was Sennacherib. He invaded Judah, all right? Main part of the Assyrian army came down the coast to Mount Carmel. At Mount Carmel, a number of the rebelling nations, such as Moab and Edom and Ammon, surrendered again without fighting. This is the second time they did that. And this didn't help Hezekiah one bit. After the nations on the eastern side of the Jordan River surrendered without fighting, Sennacherib then continued down the coast and takes the Philistine cities. While he's capturing the Philistine cities, the Egyptian army came up to stop them at a place called Aphek, and the Egyptian army was smashed, and they were now out of the revolt. Ekron was taken, the Philistine city Ekron. The nobles of Ekron were impaled. And then at Mount Carmel, Sennacherib divided his forces into two parts. Main army came down the coast, Mediterranean coast. Smaller part of his army began to move down the central mountain range, which is like the Shephelah. Now, after the Philistines were defeated, the main Assyrian army began to conquer the cities of Judah, of the Shephelah. Now, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 28 to 32, mentions the cities that were taken by Sennacherib along the coast. Micah chapter 1, verses 8 to 16, mentioned the cities taken by Sennacherib along the other side, the other road. Now, this was Micah's home territory, that's why. So with the cities of the north taken and the cities of the Shephelah taken, the last one was a city of a place called Lachish. Now, while Lachish was still being besieged, Hezekiah sues for peace. We're getting back to the text, all right? In the initial demands, Sennacherib says, Hezekiah, you must release Paddy, the king of Ekron, so you can go back there. Hezekiah released him. Then Sennacherib says, Hezekiah, you're going to pay heavy tribute to me because you've been a bad guy, bad man. Hezekiah paid the tribute. Now, this is mentioned in Sennacherib's records and also in 2 Kings 18, 13 to 16. These were the original conditions. First, Paddy, king of Ekron, was to be released. Second, heavy tribute. King Hezekiah, he met these original demands. Then King Sennacherib broke his word of no more demands, and now he made a new demand. And the new demand was this: Jerusalem must surrender and her citizens must be deported. At that point, he went one step beyond what God would permit him to do. All extra biblical records of Sennacherib's campaign, such as the writings from Egypt and Assyria, agree that something happened in the campaign against Jerusalem that stopped the conquest of the city. Sennacherib surrendered Jerusalem, city was besieged, and that's when God stepped in. In the Assyrian account of this siege, remember now, the Assyrians, no king wants to be a loser, all right? So the Assyrian kings were not in the business of recording or publicizing their failures. So when failure came, they would word it in such a way that you'd not realize it was a failure. Sennacherib claimed to have taken 46 of Judah's fortified cities. Well, that's confirmed by Isaiah 36, verse 1. It came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities and took them. Isaiah tells us that. So Sennacherib was correct. Yet in the following verses, Isaiah declared that for certain reasons the Assyrians did not succeed in capturing Jerusalem. Well, that's not what Sennacherib says. Sennacherib's annals imply this fact as well, for the king never ever stated that he took the city. All he wrote is that he shut King Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage. So while he surrounded Jerusalem, shutting the king up behind the city walls like a bird in a cage, he never captured Hezekiah. Again, both the biblical and the Assyrian records agree that something happened that caused the siege against Jerusalem to fail. This is what Sennacherib wrote concerning the campaign mentioned in Isaiah 36 to 37. All right, let's get back to the text. Now, the Jewish Assyrian delegations we see in verses 2 and 3. The king of Assyria, Sennacherib, sent Rabshakeh from Lachish, which they were besieging, to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. Then came forth unto him Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder. The Judean city of Lachish was located about 30 miles or 50 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem, and it served as a staging area for Sennacherib's army. While Lachish was still being besieged, at this point Sennacherib sent the Rabshakeh. Rabshakeh is not a name, it's a title, all right? And he was accompanied by a great army for the purpose of intimidation. So he's gone up to Jerusalem. In 2 Kings 18:17, the Rabshakeh was accompanied by two other men, Tartan and Rabsaris, and both are titles of Assyrian officers. However, the chief title was this man called Rabshakeh. Rabshakeh comes and he stands at the very same place where the confrontation between King Ahaz and the prophet Isaiah occurred in chapter 7, verse 3. He stands at the very same place. It was at the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field. Now, back then, Isaiah gave Ahaz the option to trust God or to trust Assyria. Ahaz, what did he do? He chose to trust Assyria, and he placed Judah under the Assyrian yoke. Now, several decades later, they stood in the same place. Another confrontation is taking place. This confrontation is between the men of Hezekiah and the men of Assyria. Now, in verse 3 is a Jewish delegation. First, Eliakim, who was over the house of Hezekiah in fulfillment of what Isaiah prophesied back in Isaiah 22, verses 20 to 24. And then second was Shebna, the court's scribe. Again, this is a partial fulfillment of Isaiah 22, 15 to 19, Isaiah 22, 15 to 19, and verse 25. Shebna had been demoted in the first stage. The second stage will come later and will involve his exile. Third, we have Joah, who is the recorder, who chronicled the meeting between the Jewish and the Assyrian delegations. All right, now, in here we see the defiance of Rabshakeh in verses 4 to 10. In verses 4 to 7, Rabshakeh points out the futility of Judah's confidence. In verses 4 to 5, verse 4 says, And Rabshakeh said unto them, Say ye now to Hezekiah, Thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, What confidence is this wherein you trust? Rabshakeh says that Judah's rebellion will prove to be absolutely fruitless. Judah has no defense. He never addresses Hezekiah as king. He shows no respect to Hezekiah whatsoever. While the Assyrian officer called Sennacherib the great king, he never addressed Hezekiah by his royal title. And then in verse 5, he says, I say your counsel and strength for the war are but vain words. Now on whom do you trust that you have rebelled against me? He simply says here that Hezekiah is a man of empty words and no action. Hezekiah's talk of war never goes beyond the talking stage. That's what he's saying. And then in verse 6, behold, you trust upon the staff of this bruised reed, even upon Egypt, whereon if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all that trust on him. So what's he saying here? Well, the Assyrian officer continued now the taunting by pointing out that Egypt is going to be of absolutely no help. The very thing that Isaiah predicted in Isaiah 30 verse 3, that Egypt's strength will prove your shame, has now been fulfilled. Remember, they relied on Egypt for help. Egypt had become like a splintered reed of a staff that would pierce the hand of anyone who leans on it. So those who leaned on Pharaoh would collapse with him. If the Rabshakeh had stopped at this point, he would have said exactly what Isaiah had said back in chapters 30 and 31. If he had stopped at verse 6, things would have been fine. However, he continued speaking. And in verse 7, he now said that Jehovah would also be of no help. That's going to prove to be a very, very foolish thing to say. He does not understand that Jewish monotheism is over against idolatry. He thought that Jehovah would prove useless because Hezekiah has not been faithful to Jehovah, right? Now, look at verse 7. He said, if you say unto me, we trust in Jehovah our God, is not that he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? Now, notice why the Assyrian feels that God is not going to help Judah. Why? Because Hezekiah has removed all of Jehovah's high places. Moreover, since Hezekiah has removed all of Jehovah's high places, why would Jehovah want to help him? Now, Rabshakeh did not recognize that the high places had been erected in disobedience to God's instructions, and that Hezekiah's decision to remove them was actually a sign of faithfulness to God. Therefore, with this statement, the Assyrian officer showed a considerable lack of knowledge of the nature of the God of Israel. And then in verses 8 to 10, in contrast to the weakness of Judah in verses 4 to 7, he boasts of the superiority of Assyria. In verse 8, in mocking tone, he offers a wager. Now therefore, I pray you, give pledges to my master, the king of Assyria, and I'll give you 2,000 horses, if you be able to, on your part, to set riders upon them. What he's saying is, I can provide you with 2,000 horses, but you can't provide me with the riders. The point of this taunt is that Judah does not have enough men to withstand the Assyrians. That's what he's saying, and that's quite true. In verse 9, he points to the inferiority of Egypt, which was much stronger than Judah. How then can you turn away the face of one captain of the least of my master's servants, and put your trust on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? So what he's saying here is that the smallest and the weakest Assyrian officer cannot be turned back on the basis of help from Egypt. The point is that Egypt, while being much stronger than Judah, was not strong enough to help Hezekiah. Also in verse 10, the Syrian officer pointed out that Judah's God, Jehovah, will aid Assyria and not Judah. Here he says, and am I now come up without Jehovah against this land to destroy it? Jehovah said unto me, go up against this land and destroy it. It is Judah's own God who has brought Assyria up to conquer. So Jehovah would help Assyria, not Judah. However, Assyria was merely commissioned by God to invade Judah. It is clear Assyria was clearly commissioned by God to invade Judah in Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 to 11. However, Assyria went far beyond her commission in Isaiah 10, verses 12 to 19, and that's going to prove to be Assyria's error. Nevertheless, Rabshakeh's point in verse 10 is that their God cannot help them. The God of Israel cannot help Judah. In verse 8, his point is that they're not strong enough to withstand the Assyrians. In verse 9, Egypt cannot help them. And in verse 10, he says, Jehovah will also not help them. In verses 11 to 12 of chapter 36, we see the issue of the diplomatic language here, okay? Verse 11. Then said Eliakim and Shebna and Joah unto Rabshakeh, Speak, I pray you, unto your servants in the Syrian language, for we understand it, and speak not to us in the Jews' language, in the ears of the people that are on the wall. Now, the Syrian language was Aramaic. It was a language of diplomacy. Now, according to 2 Kings 18, verses 18 to 27, 2 Kings 18, 18 to 27, and 2 Chronicles 32, verse 18, 2 Chronicles 32, verse 18, the conversation between the Assyrian delegates and their Judean counterparts took place with the people of Jerusalem listening in, because they were speaking Hebrew. Rabshakeh, as I said, Rabshakeh has spoken right throughout this whole conversation in Hebrew. He's now requested to speak in Aramaic. Why? So that the people will not understand the diplomatic language. And the reason for the request is so that fear and panic will not be spread among the people. That's why we want you to speak in Aramaic. Now, according to verse 12, the Syrian officer refused. But Rabshakeh said, Has my master sent me to your master and to you to speak these words? Has he not sent me to the men that sit upon the wall, to eat their own dung and to drink their own water with you? Sennacherib had sent his highest officers to speak to all the people, and so he was not going to switch from Hebrew to Aramaic. He wanted everyone to hear that the siege would lead to the most dreadful state of famine. Rabshakeh's answer is a good example of the psychological warfare that the Assyrians used in their negotiations with the Judeans. And now we see the demand for Jerusalem's surrender in verses 13 to 20. Rabshakeh is still speaking in Hebrew. And in verse 13, he's addressing all those along the Jerusalem wall who can hear him. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language and said, Hear ye the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. In verses 14 to 15, Rabshakeh calls upon the populace to distrust Hezekiah. He reiterates the same points to the people that he has made to the delegation. In verse 14, Thus says the king, Let not Hezekiah deceive you. This is the king Sennacherib saying, Don't let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Hezekiah cannot save you, and that is a true statement. Now in verse 15, Rabshakeh added, Neither let Hezekiah make you trust in Jehovah, saying, Jehovah will surely deliver us. This city shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. So he says, Rabshakeh says, Jehovah cannot save you, and that is a false statement. In verses 16 to 17, he goes on, Hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus saith the king of Assyria, Make your peace with me, and come out to me, and eat ye every one his vine and every one of his fig tree, and drink ye every one of the waters of his own cistern. So Rabshakeh here calls for complete submission to Sennacherib, and he gives certain promises if Jerusalem submits. The promises include, first of all, everyone will be able to return to their fields for the time being. Make your peace, he says in verse 16. A Hebrew term for peace here is not shalom, but it is barakah. Barakah. It means blessing. Seek your blessing. Hebrew reads, Make your blessing with me, because there will be a blessing if you surrender to the Assyrian yoke. That's basically what it's saying. Make your blessing with me, because there will be a blessing if you surrender to the Assyrian yoke. And the second thing we see here is that after a while, he says, you'll be deported to a good land. That's verse 17. Until I come and take you away to a land like your own land. So they've got to submit to him, total submission. And then later on, he's going to come and take him away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. So what he's saying is, for now, You'll be able to return to your own fields. Later, I'm going to deport you to a good land that is like your own land. With these words, he attempts to get the populace to revolt against King Hezekiah. And then verses 18 to 20, Rabshakeh repeats the same mistake that he made earlier, which will bring about his downfall. In verse 18, he tried to persuade the audience that it was futile to trust in Jehovah. Beware lest Hezekiah persuade you, saying, Jehovah will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? See, the gods of many other cities and nations had proven useless in helping them against the Assyrians. In verse 19, Rabshakeh listed specific nations. He says, where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? And have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Samaria was the northern kingdom of Israel. In verse 20, the Syrian officer intimated that these gods were superior to the God of Jerusalem. Who are they among all the gods of these countries that have delivered their country out of my hand, that Jehovah should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? What he's saying is greater gods than the God of Jerusalem were unable to withstand the Assyrian gods. So what could Jehovah possibly do? This is a very foolish question to raise. We see the response of the people and the delegation in verses 21 and 22. But they held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was saying, answer him not. Then came Eliakim the son of Hilkiah that was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder, to Hezekiah with their clothes rent, and told him the words of Rabshakeh. The responses to Rabshakeh's offer are, first of all, the people are silent. They don't answer in keeping with the command already given to them by the king. We see that in 2 Kings 18, verse 36. Second, the delegation now returned to King Hezekiah in mourning, because we see that they've torn their garments in verse 22. Now, we're going to see the delegation of Isaiah the prophet. We see this in chapter 37, verses 1 to 5. Here we see a delegation was now sent to Isaiah the prophet. Remember, it was Isaiah that Hezekiah disobeyed that brought about this invasion in the first place. In verse 1 of chapter 37, and it came to pass when King Hezekiah heard it, that he rent his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of Jehovah. So Hezekiah now joins in the mourning. He tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth, and he entered the temple. Now, verse 2 shows at the same time a high-ranking delegation is sent to Isaiah. And he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priest, covered with sackcloth, unto Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz. So besides Eliakim and Shebna, some leading priests, all wearing sackcloth, were sent to the prophet. Moreover, when this delegation is sent to Isaiah, it makes an abandonment now of the pro-Egyptian policy. Remember, we had those two vying factions. The pro-Egyptian policy is now dead and buried. Finally, they have discovered the error of disobeying God's prophet. And the message they sent to Isaiah is found in verses 3 to 4. This is a day of trouble. And they said unto him, thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and of rebuke and of contumely. For the children are come to the birth, and there is not enough strength to bring forth. Now, trouble from without, in that the Assyrians have taken the land. It's also a day of rebuke, because they now realize that the rebuke they have from God is for the Egyptian alliance. It is a day of contempt, or contumely it says there, because the God of Judah has been put in contempt by the Assyrians. It's a time of trouble, rebuke, and contempt. It is a time of birth pangs, but there is no strength to bear the child. It's a picture here, this is a picture of extreme distress and suffering. In the case of a pregnant woman whose time of birth has come, but the birth does not come forth, it means the death of the mother. So Judah is in that situation of facing imminent death. Judah is experiencing her own death. 46 cities have fallen so far. Jerusalem alone now stands. In verse 4, they requested divine aid. It may be, talking to Isaiah, it may be Jehovah your God will hear the words of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Assyria, his master, has sent to defy the living God, and will rebuke the words which Jehovah your God has heard. Wherefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. Now, notice here that when they addressed Isaiah, they refer Jehovah your God as Isaiah's God. They recognize the fact that they have been in disobedience. It is not Jehovah our God, but it is Isaiah, it's your God, Isaiah. They admit that Rabshakeh's mocking was directed against the true God, the living God. Now, the Assyrian officer had defied God. Perhaps now they hope that Jehovah will defy the words of the Rabshakeh and allow those who were left among the people of Judah to survive. Wherefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. And then verse 5 records the arrival of the delegation. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah. Now we see the response of Isaiah in verses 6 to 7 of chapter 37. And Isaiah said unto them, Thus shall you say to your master, Thus says Jehovah, Be not afraid of the words that you have heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I'll put a spirit in him, and he shall hear tidings, and shall return unto his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. All right, so we see here the response of Isaiah in verses 6 to 7. Isaiah makes 2 points here. First of all, concerning Hezekiah in verse 6. Remember, Hezekiah's King Hezekiah, right? In verse 6, Isaiah says to him, Do not fear. Don't be fearful. Same message that Isaiah gave to Ahaz, his father. Do not fear. The words of Rabshakeh are blasphemy against me, God, not you. Second, concerning Sennacherib in verse 7, Isaiah says, I'm going to put a spirit in him. I mean, this is what God is saying. I'm going to put a spirit in him. So the Ruach, or the spirit that God was going to put into Sennacherib, was a spirit of compulsion. He'll put a compulsive spirit in Sennacherib that will influence his conduct and his thoughts. Now, in 2 other passages, in Isaiah chapter 19, verse 14, this term here is used of a spirit of perverseness. And then in Isaiah 29, verse 10, it's used of a spirit of a deep sleep. So Sennacherib, he says, is going to hear a rumor. And this will be a rumor of a rebellion back home. And this will force him to return to Nineveh, and there Sennacherib will be killed. So we see near the letter of Sennacherib in verses 8 to 13. So Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah. For he had heard that he was departed from Lachish, and he heard say concerning Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, he is come out to fight against you. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, okay, so here we have the letter which is sent, a letter of Sennacherib, which is given in verses 8 to 30. So Hezekiah received a letter from Sennacherib. In verse 8, Rabshakeh returned to Sennacherib empty-handed because he was unsuccessful in getting Jerusalem to surrender. And by this time, we're told that Lachish had fallen, and now Libnah, another city of the Shephelah, was besieged at this time. And in verse 9 also, news begins to reach Sennacherib of an Ethiopian invasion under Tirhakah. Now, Tirhakah was a pharaoh of the 25th dynasty of Egypt and the most famous ruler of the kingdom of Cush or Ethiopia. Here he is called king prophetically because in 701 BC, when the Assyrian invasion of Judah took place, his predecessor Shabaka was still ruling over Ethiopia. So Tirkaka became king in 690 BC and he ruled until 664 BC. So this news here meant that Sennacherib will now have to spend his time handling the Ethiopians. So in addition, when he heard this news, he writes a letter to Hezekiah. You see in verse 10, "Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, Let not your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hand of the king of the Assyrians." Sennacherib makes the same mistake that Rabshakeh made. Sennacherib accuses the God of Israel of being deceptive. "Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem will not fall, for indeed it will fall." And in verse 11, "Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, by destroying them utterly, and shall you be delivered?" Sennacherib says that many other nations have fallen to Assyria. The gods of the other nations have proven to be defenseless. So why would Hezekiah think that he would be delivered? And then in verses 12 to 13, he lists numerous nations that he had conquered and makes the same point Rabshakeh made. "Have the gods of the nations delivered them which my fathers have destroyed? Gozan and Haran and Rezeph, and the children of Eden that were in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath, and the king of Arpad, and the king of the city of Sepharvaim, of Hena and Iba?" The gods of these other nations failed to deliver them from the hand of the Assyrian. So the implications then are, what do you think your God, this Jehovah, is going to be able to do? If none of the others are delivered, why should he deliver you? Or why can he deliver you? Then we see the prayer of Hezekiah in verses 14 to 20. Hezekiah finally resorts to prayer. It has come to that. In verse 14, he enters the house of Jehovah, the temple. And Hezekiah spread Sennacherib's letter before the Lord, and Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up unto the house of Jehovah, and now he spreads it before Jehovah. The king's prayer is found in verses 15 to 20, beginning in verse 15 with the introduction. "And Hezekiah prayed unto Jehovah, saying." In verse 16, the king sanctified God in such a way that he was set apart from all other gods. "O Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, that sits above the cherubim." Hezekiah addressed God as Jehovah of hosts, the leader of the angelic armies. He then called him the God of Israel, the personal God who has been revealed. This is the God who sits above the highest order of created beings, the cherubim. And you can see that in Exodus 25, verse 22, Exodus 25, 22, 1 Samuel 4:4, 1 Samuel 4:4, Psalm 80, verse 1, Psalm 80, verse 1, and Psalm 99, verse 1. So this God is above all. And then, finally, Hezekiah addressed God as the creator of all things. He continues, "You are the God. There is no one else. Even you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth, because all the other gods of the kingdoms were merely wood and stone, but not you." Whereas Sennacherib had classed Jehovah with the heathen gods, Hezekiah asserts the nothingness of these gods and the sole lordship of the God of Israel, who is in total control. And in verse 17, he prays that God will both hear and see the words of Sennacherib and the defiance of the living God. He says, Incline your ear, O Jehovah, and hear. Open your eyes, O Jehovah, and see. And hear all the words of Sennacherib, who was sent to defy the living God. And in verses 18 and 19, he admits some truth in Sennacherib's boastings. Of a truth, Jehovah, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the countries and their land, and have cast your gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they have destroyed them. Assyria has wasted many lands. Assyria has burned up their gods. However, their gods were useless because they were made of wood and stone. And so in verse 20, as he concludes his prayer and asks for deliverance, now therefore, O Jehovah our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are Jehovah, even you only. He asked God to save on the basis of who he is and what he can do. The result would be that all the kingdoms of the earth would know that Jehovah alone is God. Of a truth, Jehovah, the kings of Assyria had laid waste the countries and have cast their gods into fire, for there were no gods at the work. Have I said this? Okay. Assyria has wasted many lands. Assyria has burned up their gods. Their gods were useless because they were made of wood and stone. Sorry, I didn't transpose there. Okay. Now, and again, in verse 20, he concludes his prayer and he now asks for deliverance. Now, therefore, O Jehovah our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are Jehovah, even you only. So he asked God to save on the basis of who he is and what he can do. The result would be that all the kingdoms of the earth would know that Jehovah alone is God. We see the answer in verses 21 to 35. This is God's answer to Hezekiah's prayer by means of Isaiah the prophet. God's message to Hezekiah consisted of two parts. The first part, he answered the prayers concerning Sennacherib in verse 22 to 29. Second part, he answered the prayers concerning Judah in verses 30 to 32. God's response in verse 21. Then Isaiah the son of Amos sent unto Hezekiah, saying, Thus says Jehovah the God of Israel, whereas thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Assyria. Now, the answer concerning Sennacherib is now given in verses 22 to 29. Several points can be made here. First of all, in verse 22, this is the word which Jehovah has spoken concerning him. The virgin daughter of Zion has despised you and laughed you to scorn. The daughter of Jerusalem has shaken her head at you. So what he's saying here is that Sennacherib will fail to take Jerusalem. Jerusalem will laugh him to scorn. In addition, Jerusalem will shake her head in complete derision against Sennacherib and his man Rabshakeh. And the reason is in verse 23. It says, whom you have defied and blasphemed, and against whom you have exalted your voice and lifted up your eyes on high, even against the Holy One of Israel. Here we see that Assyria had blasphemed the Holy One of Israel. Second thing we see is the Assyrian confidence was based on their military strength in verses 24 to 25. By your servants have you defied the Lord and have said, with the multitude of my chariots am I come up to the height of the mountains, to the innermost parts of Lebanon, and I'll cut down the tall cedars thereof and the choice fir trees thereof. And I will enter into its farthest height, the forest of its fruitful field. I have digged and drunk water. With the sole of my feet will I dry up all the rivers of Egypt. So here we go. The Assyrians here possessed myriads of chariots, and they based their confidence on their military equipment and their ease of conquest of the cedars of Lebanon. Their ease of conquest is such that even the Nile of Egypt will prove to be not much of a barrier against their troops. However, What Sennacherib did not realize in verses 26 to 29 was that God was in total control. Have you not heard how I have done it long ago and formed it of ancient times? Now have I brought it to pass that it should be thine to lay waste fortified cities into ruinous heaps. What he's saying is here is that whatever Assyria accomplished was merely the carrying out of God's own divine decree. When Assyria was merely a tool in God's hand to carry out God's decree. Same point is made right back in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. Third thing we see in verse 27, the only reason nations were so easily defeated by the Assyrian army was because God decreed their destruction. He says, therefore their inhabitants were of small power. They were dismayed and confounded. They were as the grass of the field and as the green herb, as the grass on the housetops, and as a field of grain before it is grown up. Fourth thing we see is that God is also in control of Sennacherib. Verse 28. He says about Sennacherib, but I know you are sitting down and you are going out and you are coming in and you are raging against me. The fifth thing we see is because of his raging and boasting against God, God is going to punish him in verse 29. Because of your raging against me and because your arrogance has come up into mine ears, therefore will I put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I'll turn you back by the way which you came. So the Assyrians often led their captives by ropes attached to hooks in their noses. Yet now it will be the God of Israel who would put hooks in the noses of the Assyrians. He will return to his land as a failure. And the first part of Isaiah's message from God concerns Sennacherib. Second part of his answer concerns Judah. All right, well, rather than getting partway through the next session, we might just end it here. Okay, it's past. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong. We'll pick this up again next session next week.